Hey guys, thank you for watching. All right, a little bit of a different setup today in a new place, trying something out, and so we'll see how it goes. What I wanted to talk about today was I thought just with some big things that are going on in our world right now and discussions that people are having, I thought this would be a great time to remind ourselves of why it's important to teach ourselves the gospel. And so we're going to talk about the importance of teaching ourselves the gospel, and we're going to talk about specifically what it has to do with not something that is only on everybody's mind right now, but also something that is on everybody's face right now, and that is wearing masks. So if you're wondering what in the world does the gospel have to do with wearing a mask, hang in there, we're going to get to it, so I just want you to sit tight for 1 second. All right, so when you think about the gospel and you think about the bad news of the gospel, and that is this, that regardless of who we are, regardless of our age, regardless of how much money we have, where in the world we live, our skin color, anything like that, the truth of the matter is we are sinners who are under the wrath of God. And when we die, when we face judgment, there is absolutely no hope we have in and of ourselves to save ourselves. And God is fully righteous and just in condemning us. We are under condemnation. We are under the wrath of God. And the only thing that we have in common with something else is that with other people who are also lost is that we have this in common, that they are lost as well. When God saves us, when God radically transforms us, that saving faith makes us now go from being an object of wrath to a child of God. And now the thing that unites us together with other people, again, regardless of all the things that I just said before, our age, our skin color, how much money we have, where in the world we live, the gospel that saves us is so powerful that we are now united. The thing that unites us is greater than anything that may have divided us previous to our becoming followers of Christ. And so what I want to do is I want to look at two examples, one from Scripture and then another from a more recent event. And then also I want to specifically talk about what that has to do with wearing masks. And so when you think of the gospel, think of the 12 guys that Jesus chose to be his disciples. And so I just want to quickly remind us of who these 12 guys were, and then we'll talk about how the gospel brings these guys together in such an amazing way that maybe we haven't really thought about before. But in Matthew chapter 10, verses 2 through 4, it lists off the 12 disciples for us. It says, "These are the names of the 12 disciples. First, Simon, who was called Peter, then his brother Andrew, James son of Zebedee and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot." Now I want to specifically focus on two of these guys. The two I want to focus on are Matthew the tax collector and Simon the Zealot. Now, if you don't know who exactly were, let's talk about the Zealots. Who are the Zealots? The Zealots were a group of people that lived in Israel who were Jews, and these were guys that were very passionate about their country. These were guys that had tremendous pride in the fact that they were Jews. They had tremendous pride in their country. They really, really loved Israel, and they really wanted Israel to be an independent country once again. Now, the thing that was getting in their way was the Romans. And so the Romans were controlling them. And so the Zealots were a group of people that were dedicated to, that were committed to somehow, some way getting the Romans out of the country of Israel. They would do all kinds of different things. They couldn't do open war because they weren't powerful enough to fight the Roman army, but they would sometimes turn to violent means to try to basically make the Romans give up and just try to get rid of them in any way that they possibly could. So on one hand, you have the Zealots. So one of the guys that was one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, Simon, was a part of this group of Zealots. On the other hand, the other end of the spectrum, you had a tax collector who was Matthew. Now, who were the tax collectors? The tax collectors were guys who were Jews who decided to make money for themselves by collecting taxes from the Jewish people for the Romans. So they would be responsible for taking money from their fellow Jews and giving it to the Romans, and in some cases also trying to make themselves wealthy as well. Now, if you are starting a movement, if you are having a group of people that you want to work towards a common goal, if you want to have these guys get along, if you want to not have things get disrupted, if you want things to go well, you do not get a tax collector and a zealot in the same group, working towards the same goal. That is a terrible idea. That is not going to work. There's going to be dysfunction. They are going to hate each other. This is not the way that you get a group together, unless you're Jesus. And unless you know that the power of the gospel, if you want to show the world how powerful the gospel is and how truly it unites people, one of the ways that you can do that is by bringing people who others would look at and go, those guys are not going to get along at all. This is a terrible idea. But then you can see something that brings them together and see that the gospel is powerful enough to bring a tax collector and a zealot together, and it was powerful enough to bring these two guys together, even though apart from the belief in Jesus Christ and apart from the gospel saving them, these guys would have hated each other. So one example we see in Scripture about how powerful the gospel is in bringing people together and uniting people together, you see it in the makeup of the 12 disciples themselves by bringing a tax collector and a zealot together. And so that's one example from Scripture of how the gospel is powerful to unite people. Another example about how the gospel is powerful to unite people, you see in a story. This was a book that I read by a man who was a missionary in the country of Vietnam while the Vietnam War was going on. And so this is in the 1960s and the 1970s. This man was a missionary in Vietnam. And so he tells this story one time about how they were getting ready to have a church service. And so picture a church service, pews and everything like that. And so there were two guys that came into the church service. Now, actually, I'm sorry, let me back up a little bit. In the Vietnam War, let me just kind of, if you don't know, if you're not really familiar with it, the side that America fought on was on the side of the South Vietnamese, and they were fighting against the North Vietnamese. And so America fought along with the South Vietnamese army against the North Vietnamese. There was another group that was in South Vietnam at the time that mostly was made up of people who lived in South Vietnam, but they tried to fight against the South Vietnamese and fight for the North Vietnamese, and this group was called the Viet Cong. Maybe you've heard of them before, maybe you haven't, but this was a group of people that lived in South Vietnam that were traitors, you could say, that fought for the North Vietnamese, but they lived in South Vietnam at the time. And so if you have a member of the South Vietnamese army and a member of the Viet Cong, all these guys knew was to fight against each other and to hate each other. And so in this missionary tells the story of, in this church service, there were two guys that come in and they sit down on pews and they look over at each other and they see who each other were. And one of them used to be a part of the South Vietnamese army, and the other guy used to be part of the Viet Cong. And these two guys turn and look at each other, and they're aware of who the other one is. And the missionary who's writing this story is retelling what it was like for him to be in this church service, because he sees these two guys, he knows who these two guys are, and he knows that they know who each other is, and they just kind of stop and look at each other. And as he's retelling this story, he just kind of freezes because he doesn't know what is going to happen. Because the reality is, before these guys were followers of Christ, if they would have been aware of who each other was, if they would have met each other on the street and knowing who each other was, it would have ended with one of them dying. These guys were not together. These guys could not be together in the same room. These guys would have hated each other. These guys would have tried to kill each other, and they may have been a part of trying to kill each other prior to becoming followers of Christ. And so he sees this happen, and he sees this staring thing taking place, and he just kind of freezes. And then the most amazing thing happens is these two guys who are now followers of Christ actually end up hugging each other, because they understand that the gospel is powerful enough to unite them in such a way that is so much greater than what would have previously divided them. And so, okay, let's kind of bring this together. So you have the gospel is powerful enough to unite a guy who is a tax collector and a guy who's a zealot in the first century Israel. The gospel is powerful enough in the country of Vietnam to unite a guy that used to fight on the South Vietnamese army and a guy that used to be in the Viet Cong, and they normally would have hated each other. But the gospel is powerful enough to unite these two guys in spite of these differences. So let's bring this today and let's make application. I've asked you guys, if I tried to ask as many of you guys that I could, hey, just what are your opinions and thoughts about wearing masks? One of the things that I've noticed is people on social media and also just in conversations with people, and this is not, some are followers of Christ and some are not. Some people have, when they're talking about whatever opinion they have about wearing masks or not wearing masks, when they're talking about somebody who has a different opinion than them, it's easy to, and I've noticed that some people do this, not everybody, but some people, what they will do is when they're talking about somebody who has a different opinion than them, they will accuse the person that has a different opinion than them of something that is really, really kind of crazy. And so if it's a person who doesn't think that wearing masks is a good idea, and they're talking about somebody who thinks wearing masks is a good idea, they might say something negative against them. Or if you're talking about somebody who thinks that wearing masks is a good idea, and they're talking about somebody who doesn't wear masks or doesn't agree that wearing masks is a good idea, well, you hate people and you want them to die. And it's like, oh my goodness, what in the world are we doing? We're talking about. And so I'm not saying everybody does this, but one of the things that I think is helpful for us, and I want you guys to remember, I thought you guys did a great job when I asked you guys, hey, what's your opinion about wearing masks? Everybody had an opinion pretty much, and you all did a good job of being able to communicate it clearly and weren't, demonizing the other person about it or something like that if they had a different opinion than you. But I want to encourage you guys to remember, teach the gospel to yourself, because if the gospel is powerful enough to unite tax collectors and zealots, if the gospel is powerful enough to unite South Vietnamese and Viet Cong, then obviously the gospel is powerful to unite people that have differing opinions about things. And so it's not wrong to have an opinion about something. It's not wrong to have a strong opinion about something. But we want to be careful about attacking somebody who has a different opinion than us, especially if we're followers of Christ and we're talking about somebody who is a follower of Christ too. And we need to remember that the gospel is powerful enough to unite us, and we can look to examples in Scripture, and we can remember this example of this missionary in Vietnam to hopefully to help us to remember that the gospel is powerful enough to unite us. And remember the words of Jesus in John chapter 13. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. And so let's take to heart what Pastor Ross has been teaching us on Sunday mornings, that we not only love God, but that we love other people, and that is the second greatest commandment. And let's work on continuing to remember the gospel and loving each other so that the lost world can see our love for each other. And even if we have differing opinions about things, they can see our love for each other that supersedes that and that's greater than that, and that they can know that we truly are disciples of Jesus Christ, and that they can ask us about the gospel, and so that we can talk to them about that. And so I hope this is encouraging. This is a great opportunity for us to remember the gospel and teach it to ourselves. And this is a great time to think about, how it unites us and how it brings us together. In a day and age where people are trying to, Satan's trying to divide us, this is a great time to to remember what it is that unites us. And so I hope this has been encouraging. Thank you guys for watching. On behalf of Lindsay and I, we love you guys, and God bless.